Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 21st of September, where we are continuing our discussion of short story. Last class, we read A Sorrowful Woman, and if nothing else, I wanted to use it as a contrast piece to A Secret Sorrow, and that ultimately a sorrowful woman has a level of depth and complexity and creativity that we just don't see in a sorrowful woman. And this gets back to the idea of what we were discussing in terms of literature and what makes a piece of literature worthy of study. And while there are some subjective elements in terms of determining which literature we read, we talked about the canon, those works considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of study. I think that despite the subjectivity that might be involved in determining what's canonical, I think these two pieces illustrate A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, why it is that we devote our attention to some pieces of literature and not others in English classes. And while A Sorrowful Woman might be considered to not necessarily be part of the canon, it does have a level of depth and complexity that we just don't see in A Secret Sorrow. And I think that we will continue to see this in the short stories that we will be reading over the course of the semester, including The Story of an Hour, which is what I had assigned for us today, even though it was in an earlier set of readings, but I wanted us to view it with a more critical eye. And even though it was written in 1894, it still has a good number of similarities to A Sorrowful Woman. Kate Chopin is part of that literary canon that's usually studied by scholars and critics. In fact, she's included in my own women in literature class. So I wouldn't be surprised if Gail Godwin in A Sorrowful Woman knew the story of an hour and was basically springboarding off of that with her own take on it, which is one of the reasons why I like to think of literature from a chronological perspective, because oftentimes the earlier works have influenced later artists, which we see also in things like music and dance and art and many other areas. So this life-changing hour, the story of an hour, even though it's quite short, has a lot of depth and complexity to it. In fact, I've suggested that the shorter the text, the more likely it is to have depth and complexity if it is considered to be a piece of literature that's worthy of study, because every element needs to have some sort of a significance to it in a way that you might not necessarily find in a longer text, such as a novel. And I drew your attention to the idea of the selection of names, specifically Mrs. Mallard, asking you to do a little bit of research about mallards to see if you could find any connections between the use of the name Mallard with the actual character. As many of you indicated, or all of you indicated, mallards are birds, they're ducks. I can tell you that Kate Chopin oftentimes likes to use bird imagery in her writing to represent the situation of female. A bird can be entrapped within a cage, or a female can be entrapped within the home. However, a bird can spread its wings, so to speak, and begin to examine new horizons. And that's also something that I think we can see with a Mrs. Mallard. That said, a mallard is a common bird, a common duck, and perhaps that also is relevant in Kate Chopin suggesting that this might be a more common plight for the female than is discussed publicly. At the time in which the story was written, it would have been considered rather progressive. And perhaps even in today's world, it could be considered rather progressive. The idea that a woman, upon learning of her supposed widowhood, celebrates rather than grieves. And while she does admit that she did love her husband, it was only sometimes, which illustrates the complexity associated with love, where you can love and not love someone at the same time. And I think the time period is particularly important, 1894. So while we were talking about A Sorrowful Woman not necessarily having the kinds of freedom she would have wanted in the 1970s, think about what life would have been like in the late 1800s, when women could not own property, when women could not vote, when women basically did not have careers. And the way a woman could achieve status and independence in this society is through widowhood. Divorce really wouldn't have been an option during the time period, and the idea of a woman not marrying would have seemed rather scandalous. And of course, there's the question of how would a woman be able to financially support herself without a partner. But if a woman was widowed and there was property left behind and there weren't any direct heirs, and notice no children are mentioned in this story, then it would be a very comfortable position for female. Perhaps explaining why women during these time periods when they lost their spouse were less likely to remarry than men during these time periods when they lost their spouse. Perhaps because women were caretakers for men, but women realized that without men, they could achieve a certain level of independence that they couldn't necessarily otherwise achieve in society. But that idea of the mallard, I also suggest that the male mallard also tends to be quite colorful and draws much more attention. I would suggest that that could also be comparable to the male in society during this time period, that would be given more attention and more respect and basically more prestige and more honor. And if you think about the way Mrs. Mallard is introduced, notice that she is not introduced by her first name, which is Louise. That only comes later. The idea is that she is an attachment to her husband. The Mrs. is a title that clearly denotes the marital status of a female. Notice there isn't something comparable for male. Mr. can apply for either married or single men. And when we are introduced to her name, Louise, later on, and we learn about also her sister, Josephine, both those names strike me as particularly interesting because their initial roots, Joseph and Louis, are male centric. Again, perhaps illustrating the idea of the male centric nature of the 1800s. Notice how Mr. Mallard is initially introduced with his first name as well as his surname, Brentley, which gives him a sense of individuality. We're also told at the very beginning that Mrs. Mallard suffers from heart trouble, which is quite different than heart disease, which is discussed at the ending. If she has a troubled heart, the suggestion is that this is symbolic, that the heart is oftentimes viewed as the place for emotions, and that this is more than just a physiological ailment of heart disease, but this is also an emotional ailment. And we assume, based on the way the story progresses, that it has something to do with the way that marriage could have entrapped female during this time period. Lots of symbols of freedom in this particular text. This idea of her looking out an open window. Notice how, again, she is indoors, but the idea of an open window suggests that she can escape to the outer world. And we had talked about this as well with the Sorrowful Woman, and how basically for the most part of the story, she basically is indoors within the home. The roomy armchair that Mrs. Mallard or Louise Mallard sits in, and that an armchair is meant for a single individual, not necessarily for a couple or for multiples. And again, now she's finding her new life as an independent unit. Also, the idea of an armchair, particularly during this time period, was oftentimes associated with male, and that this would be the place where there would be the preferred seating for male in a living room or in a sitting room. The fact that Mrs. Mallard looks out into an open square, again reinforcing this idea of freedom and openness and opportunity. The fact that this story takes place in spring, which suggests rebirth and renewal. There are also references to sparrows in addition to references to mallards. Again, Kate Chopin very much enjoys her bird imagery. Rain, which could be seen as a negative, but it can also be seen as a positive, especially because we're told that blue skies are beginning to peek through, which begins to suggest that this is going to be the ending of this rainy period. But rain or water can also be viewed as a positive in that it can bring forth life and renewal, regeneration. And also rain and water can be cleansing as well. And we find out that Mrs. Mallard is young, but she is repressed, and that her face bespoke repression. We assume, again, it has something to do with not so much Brentley Mallard per se, but the institution of marriage as a whole. And she says she feels something creeping towards her. Lots of negative associations with the word creeping. So again, this isn't necessarily something that she is looking forward to initially. One suggests that perhaps she never even allowed herself the opportunity to contemplate freedom until this very moment. And then, of course, she actually says literally, free, 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 body and soul, free. This would be a great quotation to use if you are arguing that she feels free for obvious reasons. And she talks about her husband and how he had kind, tender hands. So there isn't any kind of reference to the idea of him being abusive or him being hurtful to her. In fact, he never looked save with love upon her, which is one of the reasons why she loved him sometimes. But even though he specifically may not necessarily have been repressing her, and the idea is that all female would be repressed during this time period through the institution of marriage, because she wouldn't be able to live for herself, which is something that she can now do upon her widowhood. And one of my favorite quotes in the text is that there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And one of the reasons why I like that particular quote so much, and that happens to be on page 16, at least in my version, is that I think it really illustrates the idea that this is more than just a feminist text, even though it's usually read as a commentary about the role of female being entrapped in society. But this line suggests that it's marriage itself and the institution of marriage. No powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And that, I think, really broadens the text. And as we continue on, we learn that she's looking forward to life in a way she hadn't been before. Spring days and summer days. Again, times of the season that are associated with birth and renewal. And then, of course, we find out that it was just a terrible misunderstanding, that Brentley Mallard had been far from the scene of the accident. And, of course, there is speculation about how Richards, the family friend, could have made such a mistake, but it's only speculation, because if Chopin wanted us to focus on that in her text, she would have given us more information about Richards. So we have to assume this is an innocent mistake. And, of course, the ending when she sees that her husband is not dead after all, which means that she's now going to have to give up the freedom that she had just seconds earlier thought that she had found. When the doctors came, they said she died of heart disease. Notice they're not saying heart trouble. They assume this is physiological. Of joy that kills, a rather ironic ending. They assume that she's so overjoyed with seeing her husband and the shock of it has killed her because she has a weak heart. And there could be some truth to that, because she did love him sometimes. However, what we know and the other characters don't know, because we spent time with her alone when she was able to contemplate what life as a widow would be like, what we know is that she probably also is experiencing a sense of loss and disappointment over a freedom that she thought she had gained that she no longer has. And that could also perhaps be another way to read this particular text, is how the medical community and even those around her, including her own sister, how clueless they are about the reality of what she's truly feeling. So if we were to read this particular text and think a little bit about how it could be formulaic, I draw your attention to paragraph 10, or for me, this would be on page 15, where her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. If this was going to be a piece of formula fiction, this sounds like the introduction to an erotic episode, but it's not. And then when we think about things like very carefully determined details, not just open windows and roomy armchairs, a peddler crying his wares. Crying is usually viewed as negative, but in this instance, it could be seen as positive. And when you're crying out your wares, you're trying to sell your products. Or even something like the idea that the West is mentioned. And this is when there was rain in the air. Of course, we're talking about the idea of the blue skies that happen to be peeking through. And when you think about all of the associations with the West, whether it be the westward expansion and the idea that this is new opportunity for her, or the sun sets in the West, so this could be the ending of an old life, and of course, the beginning of a new life. So, reading for all of these details is something that I don't think we would be able to get with A Secret Sorrow, but definitely we can get with A Sorrowful Woman, and definitely we can get with The Story of an Hour. But I also wanted to draw your attention to some of the commentary. For me, this is on page 18 at the very ending of this particular story, because I think it behooves us to think about these things as we are studying literature. And we're asked, did you find Mrs. Mallard a sympathetic character? Some readers think she's callous, selfish, and unnatural, even monstrous, because she revels in her newly discovered sense of freedom so soon after learning of her husband's presumed death. Others read her as a victim of her inability to control her own life in a repressive, male-dominated society. Is it possible to hold both views simultaneously? Are your views in any way influenced by your being male or female? Does your age affect your perception? What about your social and economic background? Does your nationality, race, religion, in any way shape your attitude? Do you have particular views about the institution of marriage that inform your assessment of Mrs. Mallard's character? Have other reading experiences, perhaps a familiarity with some of Chopin's other stories, predisposed you in one way or another to Mrs. Mallard? Understanding potential influences might be useful in determining whether a particular response to Mrs. Mallard is based primarily on the details of the story and their arrangement, or on the bias, however subtle, that is brought to the story by the reader. And we all have bias. There's no way around that. Authors have bias, editors have bias, teachers have bias, readers have bias. But I think these questions are particularly useful to talk a little bit about how it's possible to have multiplicity of interpretation for literature and have them all be valid, assuming there's evidence in the text in order to be able to support that. So depending on which pieces of evidence, much like a good attorney in a courtroom, you pick and choose your pieces of evidence to make the strongest case and argument than you can to the judge and to the jury. So, and a good attorney could argue either position of a case based on the evidence that presents itself. Though obviously some pieces of evidence are stronger and some pieces of evidence are weaker. But good attorneys can basically manipulate that evidence and present it in a way that is to their benefit and to their side's benefit. So, and that's basically what you are doing as a reader. But think about how I had suggested earlier that my understanding of some of Chopin's use of birds and other works helped influence my reading of this particular short story. So yes, my experiences with Chopin in the past have influenced me. And I'm quite aware that she's known as a feminist author during a time period when women didn't have much voice or much agency. And I've always suspected that if I were to teach this story to a group of newlyweds and then teach this story to a group of newly divorced couples, that I would have very different responses to the very same story. And that both of those responses could have some validity within them. But it's just a question of the temperaments and the ideologies of the people who happen to be reading the piece, even though the piece itself doesn't change. So, I wanted to move forward with another story that's considered to be canonical. William Faulkner is an author that you may have heard of, and his short story, A Rose for Emily, I think is a wonderful short story for a number of reasons. If for no other reason, there was a short interview at the ending of the story in which he talks a little bit about his thoughts and his feelings and his motivations for that particular story. So I thought that was an interesting lens in which for us to examine literature, illustrating, as we will discuss, that even if the author is making a particular argument, that doesn't necessarily mean that is the only argument that can be made for a particular piece of literature, even though the author himself or herself actually created that piece of literature. So the date of A Rose for Emily, 1931. Notice how I keep focusing on the dates because the dates give us a sense of time and place. So again, a story can be set in the past or in the future, but if we aren't given any kind of clues that the story is set in the past or the future, then we assume the story is set in the time in which the story was written. So 1931. So this is going to help us understand what the South might have been like and also understand someone like Miss Emily, a fallen Southern aristocrat, as the world was changing and becoming much more modern. Now, one of the problems with this particular story is perhaps keeping track of the plot, which honestly is not that complex if we were to read it in chronological order, but the author does not put the plot in chronological order, deliberately so, to try to hide the ending from us, because the plot in many ways is rather formulaic. There's a woman who basically is not given the opportunity to date and to be independent because her father is oppressive. Eventually, her father dies, and she has great difficulty accepting the fact that he dies. She holds on to his body for several days, 3 days actually. And then after that, she begins to date, and her choice is rather eyebrow raising. Homer Barron. She is a Southern aristocrat, so she comes from a certain level of society. She's dating a laborer, so he's much beneath her. He's also a Northerner, which would, even at this time, be considered to be the enemy. It wasn't that long ago that the South went through Reconstruction. And then it turns out that Homer is not somebody who really is the marrying kind. He's not likely to want to settle down. She ends up visiting a druggist where she buys some arsenic. The druggist asks her, what is the purpose for the arsenic? Because she's supposed to legally, or from a legal perspective, she's supposed to disclose why she's buying it. She refuses to say. He basically fills in for rats because he doesn't want to confront her because he's intimidated by her. And then it turns out that Homer goes into her home and he disappears. And then there's a smell that comes out of her home, and the community, rather than confronting her about the smell, they basically cover it up. Again, because they're intimidated by her and they don't want to address her. And she becomes a recluse. And upon her death, individuals go to her funeral more out of curiosity than out of respect or grief. And they basically enter into the home where they find that there is a sealed off room that has, and this is supposed to be the surprise ending, if we weren't able to figure it out because of the mixed chronology, the man himself lay in the bed. In other words, Homer's body. Though you may have been clever enough to figure out that she killed Homer, but you may not have been clever enough to figure out the very last climax where there is the indentation of a head on a pillow, where basically the assumption is that she has been lying next to the corpse long after the corpse has decayed. So this is also a story of necrophilia. It's a very dark and disturbing story, and it's known as Southern Gothic. And in fact, I teach a class in Gothic literature, and Gothic literature is really the foundation of horror literature, where basically there are conventions such as things like old homes that are decrepit, hidden secrets, possible supernatural activity, things of that nature. And the Gothic tradition began in England, and basically it moved to the United States. The Gothic tradition began in the 1700s, but really it reached its heyday in the 1800s with texts you probably have some familiarity with, things like Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Even though you haven't read these texts, you've probably heard of them because they're part of our popular culture. And then the American tradition, which started in the late 1800s and moved to the 1900s, took basically some of the conventions from Britain, but they modernized it to suit American tastes. And authors like William Faulkner, who were housed in the South, were creating a kind of Gothic literature known as Southern Gothic, that rather than placing their Gothic tales in castles or in Europe, they were placing their tales in Southern society and talking about the decrepit nature of humanity that could oftentimes be found in places like southern United States, but not necessarily exclusively southern United States. Though Faulkner himself, being a southerner, would oftentimes write about the South and about the South's troublesome past with slavery. So that's embedded within this particular text as well. And some of the things that you can consider with A Rose for Emily is just the title itself. And I've been reinforcing this idea that titles are so important. A Rose for Emily. And when we think about possible rose imagery, more often than not, we think about something like flowers. And of course, a rose is oftentimes given for situations or important events such as romances, or perhaps even for funerals, and both are applicable in this particular story. More often than not, people think of red roses, though roses come in a multiplicity of colors. Red also has lots of associations with it as well. Blood, lust, passion, all of that would work. Anger would work for this particular story. If you think about the rose, it's got the delicate flower, which we could see Emily as perhaps being, but it also has thorns, which can hurt and prick. And of course, we see the other side to Emily, where basically we find out that she's a murderer, or she becomes a murderer. One other detail about the plot that we're given about midway through the story: insanity runs in her family. So again, when you put all of this together, it seems obvious, but Faulkner mixes the chronology so that it doesn't seem obvious for us. Roses oftentimes are kept as mementos. In fact, sometimes they are saved and they're dried, and they're kept forever. And one might say this is exactly what Emily does with Homer. She saves him and lets him dry out. Again, this is a Gothic tale, so there's supposed to be this ew factor associated with it. The color rose isn't necessarily red, but it isn't necessarily white either. It's a mixture of the two. And again, we can say something comparable when we were talking about gray and A Sorrowful Woman. It's not black or white. If red represents evil or passion, and white represents innocence or virginity, we could say that Emily is a combination of the two, perhaps, through the color rose. Rose is also a verb, the past tense of rise, when somebody rose or stood up. And think about the idea of the convention of Southern aristocracy, especially male Southern aristocracy, to stand up when a woman walked into the room. And that's part of this story, is that Emily comes from a dead past, in effect. So death plays a big role in the story, not just in terms of the deaths of Emily's father and the deaths of Homer Barron. And just think about the name Homer Baron, too. I always think of the robber barons, about how they basically represented this new order of creating wealth, rather than not necessarily relying on a system of slavery. It was more of a system of commerce. That said, that's not to say that the robber barons didn't earn their name, because they were indeed paying insufficient wages to their employees, but there were wages, unlike slavery when there were no wages at all. So, but if you want to think of Emily as representing a dead past, and there's lots of references to that in the story as well. She doesn't want to move on with the future. She doesn't want postal delivery to her home. She is writing in calligraphy. Her home is talked about how it's filled with dust and disuse. She no longer wants to pay taxes. This was an arrangement that was made back In the earlier days, shortly after her father had died, because while Miss Emily still has the Grierson name, she has the status. It's a family that had status but no longer had money, and because of the system of slavery, which had collapsed by that point, was no longer existent. So you think about Miss Emily not being able to pay her taxes, and some of the leaders of the community trying to respect her honor and her dignity as a Southern aristocrat, create the story that basically her father had lent the town money, and the town was repaying it back by saying that she didn't have to pay her taxes. This was a lie in order to allow her to keep her dignity. And when the new generation comes in, the new order, they don't want to abide by this agreement. They want their taxes. And she keeps saying no. Tellingly, she says, talk to Colonel Sartoris about it. Colonel Sartoris has been dead for several years at this point, which again illustrates some of the problems she has with death. The fact that she teaches China painting lessons, even though the new generation is no longer interested in China painting. So there's reference after reference to her living in a dead past, which I think is much more important in terms of our understanding of death than thinking about the literal deaths that go on with Miss Emily initially, and then, of course, with her father and with Homer. So if you wanted to also think a little bit about this story in terms of foreshadowing, you probably need to reread it, because once you reread it and you put together the pieces of the family insanity, the domineering father, her denial of her father's death for 3 days. 3 is oftentimes a very important number symbolically. 3 can represent past, present, and future, so it can represent time, which is definitely an issue in this particular text. 3 oftentimes has Christian analogies associated with it: Father, Son, Holy Ghost, Trinity, and so forth. The fact that she buys arsenic and the druggist says that it's for rats, it's poison for rats. Perhaps we could even say that even though the druggist doesn't realize that she is kind of killing a rat, that Homer has been stringing her along, but he's not going to be committing to her. His disappearance, the smell, her reclusiveness afterwards. And also think a little bit about her servant, who's referred to as the quote Negro unquote servant. This is very much an indicator of the time period, very troublesome time period, with its use of language. And I think it's important to be able to read pieces from this time period, even when it uses uncomfortable and offensive language, because it serves as a lens into our history. And if we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And the difference between having a servant as opposed to having a slave. And we get very little information about this particular character, but he does stay with Miss Emily throughout. That's one of the ways that she's able to maintain her life of reclusiveness. But as soon as she's dead, he disappears. So he no longer feels any kind of sense of responsibility or any sense of connection to her. So I had indicated that there was a short interview with William Faulkner, and this is what I wanted to talk about next class. But what I wanted you to talk about in terms of today's attendance question, which would be due Wednesday the 22nd at 10 a.m., though certainly if you need an extension, please ask me. It's about quotation. You'll notice that I've talked about A Rose for Emily in a very broad way, but I haven't talked about any quotation, because I was hoping you could identify an important quote in Rose for Emily and indicate why it is important, so that next class we could talk about quotations from the text itself, and also we could talk about that interview with William Faulkner, as well as briefly, very briefly, I wanted to talk about the glossary, which is included in your text. And then we can move forward to 3 short stories. So we're moving a little bit more quickly at this point. And the 3 short stories are Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now, this is an older text, so the language is probably going to be a little bit more difficult, but it is a lens into Puritanism in New England, which is basically our area, and Puritanism has helped to form our society. So I think from that perspective, if nothing else, Young Goodman Brown is a very interesting text. Soldier's Home. And this was a text that, even though it was written quite a while ago, sadly still has a lot of contemporary relevance. I can't think of a time when we haven't had one, if not several, wars going on in our planet the entire time that I've been teaching, at any rate. So, Soldier's Home happens to be the story of a soldier who returns home. This is from World War One, and the difficulty he has, Krebs is his name, reintegrating back into society. This is from Ernest Hemingway. Again, another name that you might be familiar with in terms of the canon. And then lastly, a short story called Battle Royal that actually appears in the beginning of a novel called Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And Invisible Man is not the same as The Invisible Man, which is the science fiction story about a man who becomes invisible. Invisible Man happens to be the story of a person who is unnamed throughout the story. That'll be important because he feels that he is invisible because he is black, and he feels that he's not viewed for his individuality. He's merely seen based on the color of his skin. And this text talks about, from the 1950s perspective, some of the challenges and difficulties the Invisible Man has in terms of trying to find equality and respect in society. So that gives you a very general idea of what these three pieces are, though I'll talk about them in much further depth, as well as eventually we'll talk a little bit more too about writing journals. Remember, you are being tasked with choosing 3 short stories in the short story unit that we've covered and writing approximately a page or so in response to each of the 3 short stories you choose. You can refer to all 3 of the short stories as independent units, or if you wanted to talk about them in connection with one another, you could. But think of it as a kind of informal dialogue on paper where you could talk about much of what I've covered in class videos, much of what your peers have covered in the class discussion forum, as well as your own thoughts and observations as well with the text. And this way, it might help you come up with some ideas for some more formal writing that we'll be doing over the course of the semester when we actually write a paper about short story of approximately 4 to 5 pages. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in greater depth as well as that becomes applicable. But now that we are in the midst of short story, whenever you get to the point where you think you feel comfortable responding to 3 of the short stories, you can do that and submit that into me. Though your short story journal is not going to be due until we reach the ending of our short story unit, in the event that you wanted to be able to read all of the short stories first before making a determination as to which 3 you would select to write informally about for your journal. So I'm looking forward to see what quotes you select from A Rose for Emily and why you would select those particular quotes. And that's where we will pick up next class. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on with A Rose for Emily. Take care. Bye-bye.